Good afternoon. Welcome to our Bible study. We're continuing in our series of studies on getting to know Jesus. The Apostle Paul said, I count everything else but loss compared to knowing Christ. So if it's good enough for him, it's probably good enough for us. We're looking at the end of, or the culmination of God's master plan for over 2,000 years. He had been working toward this time in history. Jesus Christ came to the earth to fulfill four basic functions, four missions he had. First, he was to restore the kingdom. God had given mankind a kingdom in the garden, and sin had destroyed that dream. So Jesus has come, and the thing he talked about the most was restoring the kingdom. The kingdom is near. Jesus also came to be our sacrifice for sin. Sin demands payment. God's justice demands that sin has to be paid for. God can't just overlook it. He can't just forget about it. It's got to be dealt with. And the only way that mankind could be saved, and God loved us enough to send his only Son. And Jesus qualified to be our sin sacrifice. And by giving his life on the cross, he paid our sin debt. Jesus also came to defeat death. The resurrection was the defeat of Satan, the crushing of his head, and so that we can also live forever. So Jesus had to be resurrected to defeat death itself. And then finally, Jesus came to institute the new covenant. The will and the death of Jesus had to occur so that the new covenant could go into effect. So in our story, we've come to the end of Jesus' life. He has spent several years in Galilee primarily and in Judea, preaching about the kingdom and salvation and seeking the lost and so forth. Now he has come to Jerusalem for the final time. He told his apostles he had to go to Jerusalem to give his life, to die on the cross. Of course, the apostles didn't understand what he was talking about, but this is what's happened. And so we saw that Jesus entered Jerusalem on a Sunday riding on the donkey. And this was a declaration that he was the king. And the people were yelling, Hosanna, and Jesus, God saves. And they were expecting Jesus to be the Messiah, to be the one who would deliver them from Roman domination. The Jews, by and large, expected Jesus to declare himself the king and lead a holy war and conquer the Romans. And the Jews, this was what they had been taught for hundreds of years, that the Messiah was going to come and deliver them from domination. The Jews had been under foreign domination for about 600 years. And finally, maybe this Jesus was the one, because he could do the miracles. And maybe he was the one they had been waiting for. So they're all excited. But the leadership of the Jews wasn't nearly as excited about Jesus. The Pharisees looked at Jesus as a change agent, a troublemaker. The Pharisees had had their origin during the intertestamental period between the Old and New Testaments, when the Greeks had invaded Palestine and put Palestine under their domination. The Greeks had tried to change the law of Moses. They had outlawed it. They had tried to change all the Jewish religion. And the Pharisees had come up during this period, and their goal was to protect the law. Unfortunately, over the centuries, in protecting the law, they had come up with all of their own rules. And their rules over time had become as important to them as Scripture itself. And so they argued with Jesus on many occasions about the traditions of the fathers. And they argued with him about washing your hands and all the keeping the Sabbath day. And they had thousands of rules that they had come up with, ostensibly to protect the law. But unfortunately, when men come up with rules to protect God's law, eventually the rules become as important as the law itself. And so the Pharisees hated Jesus because they viewed him as trying to change the law and not obeying their rules. And they questioned his authority on many occasions. Who gave you this authority? By what authority are you doing these things? And so they had problems with Jesus. But it was really the Sadducees that hated Jesus the most, that wanted him dead. The Sadducees were the political leaders of the nation. They didn't care so much about the religious elements as the political elements. And they were getting fabulously wealthy off of the temple worship. And Jesus was a threat to them. They were scared to death that Jesus was going to declare himself the king and that he would lead a rebellion against the Romans. So some others had tried this in previous years, and they were afraid Jesus was actually popular enough to do it. And if the Romans came in, then obviously their little house would be done away with, and they might be killed. They would certainly lose their financial base. So they wanted Jesus dead. So the Jews, particularly the leaders, had been looking for something to charge Jesus with. They had to come up with something that the common man would accept. They knew Jesus was very popular, and they knew that if they just arrested him out and out, that there might be a riot that they were trying to avoid to start with. So they had to come up with something to charge Jesus with that the average Jew would accept. And so the night Jesus observed the Passover with his apostles and instituted the Lord's Supper, he went to the garden to pray. We remember that. And so the crowd, the temple soldiers and the priests had led the mob into the garden to find Jesus, led by the traitor. And so they found Jesus and arrested him, and then they took him through a series of trials for the rest of that evening. Most of these trials were done illegally. Even under Jewish law, you could not try anybody at night. And so the Jews had trying to work around things. They were trying to come up with something they could charge Jesus with that would be serious enough to put him to death. So first of all, we have the record that you have to look at all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and put this together because they're not in order in any one of those books. The text indicates that the first thing they did was they took Jesus from the Mount of Olives, across the city to the house of Annas. Annas had been the high priest, and he had been replaced by the Romans. And he was still a very powerful figure in Jewish politics. And so Jesus was carried to the house of Annas. And there Annas began to question Jesus about his teachings and about his apostles. And he's trying to come up with something they can use against Jesus. They don't really have anything concrete. And so they're looking desperately to find something to charge Jesus with. So this is recorded in John 18. Annas questions Jesus about his teachings. And finally, Annas then decides to send Jesus to the house of Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the current high priest. He is ostensibly the ruler of the Jewish nation. He's the most powerful political figure. And so Jesus is sent under guard over to the house of Caiaphas. And in Caiaphas' house, Jesus stands before Caiaphas and the partial Sanhedrin. The entire Sanhedrin will not meet till the next morning, but part of the Sanhedrin was there, probably kind of an executive council. And Caiaphas needs to come up with something that he can charge Jesus with, that the council, the entire Sanhedrin, the 70 members of the Supreme Sanhedrin, would consider worthy of death. And so we have several passages, we talked about these last week, where Jesus was brought before this group, and they finally got Jesus to say that he was the Son of God. So Caiaphas now had a charge, because he could now accuse Jesus of claiming to be God. He could accuse him of blasphemy. And so Jesus, the next morning, the first thing, as soon as it gets light, Jesus was carried before the full Sanhedrin. And there they brought in all kinds of false witnesses, and they contradicted themselves, and they were still having trouble. But finally, they got Jesus to say that he was the Son of God, and so they had their charge. Plus, they had some witnesses that said he would destroy the temple. Well, he hadn't said he would destroy the temple. That was just a lie. He had talked about his own body. He was not talking about the temple itself, but they they didn't care about the truth exactly. So they had something they could use. And so Jesus went before the full 70 members of the Sanhedrin, and they charged him with blasphemy. And so now they had their charge. They condemned him to death. But they still have a problem. When the Romans had taken over, they disallowed the Jews from executing people. They took away their power at the death penalty, except in very narrow cases. Well, Jesus, they could not execute him on their own. They had to have Roman authority. So now they have to carry him to Pilate. So they carry him before Pilate, the governor, the Roman governor. Years earlier, when Herod had died, King Herod had died, his kingdom had been divided between his 3 sons. The one of his sons ruling over Jerusalem, Judea, was so terrible that the Romans replaced him with a Roman governor. And so this is why there's a Roman governor here instead of a Jewish king. And so the Jews carry Jesus to Pilate. They want him to give the death penalty so they can execute Jesus. Pilate is the Roman authority in town. Now, Pilate doesn't live in Jerusalem. Pilate lives in Caesarea, where the Roman garrison is. But he comes to town for the Jewish festival. This is the week of Passover. And so Pilate is in the palace. There's a palace built on the north, or a fortress built on the north side of the Temple Mount called the Fortress Antonia. And here's where Pilate and his soldiers are garrisoned. And so Jesus is brought to Pilate to be condemned. The Jews bring in all these charges, but they know that the charges they have condemned him for won't work. So they have to come up with some other charges. And so they they accuse Jesus of tax evasion, which is flatly wrong, because when Jesus had discussed the subject of taxes, he had said, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's, pay your taxes." They also charged him with inciting to rebellion, which is again flatly a lie, because Jesus had said, "Submit to the Roman authorities." And they charged him with claiming to be the king. Well, he did claim to be the king of the Jews. But the Jews are trying to twist this to make it sound like Jesus is opposed to the rule of Caesar, which again is flatly wrong. But at least they have some charges the Romans might accept. Now, Pilate realizes that Jesus is not really guilty of anything worthy of death. He knows that these charges are brought by the Jews as a matter of Jewish laws and Jewish jealousies, and he knows that Jesus certainly does not deserve to die under Roman law. So Pilate doesn't want to go along with the Jewish leaders. He doesn't like them, for one thing. They have been a thorn in his side, and they have not had a lot of love lost between them. And so Pilate is looking for a way out of this. He doesn't want to execute Jesus. And so he finds out that Jesus is a Galilean. Now, Galilee is still under the authority of one of the Herods, one of the descendants of Herod the Great. And he finds out that Herod is in town. Herod has come to Jerusalem for the festival. And since Herod is in town and Herod has authority over Galilee's citizens, he says, "Aha, I'll just send Jesus over to Herod and let him deal with the problem, and I won't have to mess with it." So the 5th trial that Jesus went through, he was sent to King Herod. Now, King Herod had never met Jesus. He had heard about him in Galilee. Jesus spent most of his ministry in Galilee, and he had heard about this Jesus guy. He had heard that Jesus could do miracles. And so he wanted to meet Jesus, and he was hoping Jesus would do some tricks, do some miracles. And Herod met with Jesus, and Jesus would not cooperate. So finally, Herod has his soldiers rough Jesus up a little bit, and they dress him up in a fake robe and sends him back to Pilate. So the final trial, Jesus is sent back to Pilate. Well, Pilate's now got him on his hands. What's he going to do? He's got to do something. So he tries to argue with the Jewish leaders, and he says, well, I can't find anything wrong with this man. And so he thought, okay, I'll give them an option. Now, it had been a practice for years that whenever the Passover feast was held, that the Romans would release one Jewish prisoner back to the people as a gesture of goodwill. And Pilate thought, aha, I've got a good solution to this problem. He happened to have in his prisons one of the most notorious criminals in the land, a man by the name of Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was the word used in the text means he was a kind of a terrorist. He was a murderer. He was a thief. He was guilty of all kinds of crimes. Now, in the years that the Jews had been under the domination of other nations, particularly the Greeks, there had risen a sect of the Jews that was kind of a paramilitary group. And they believed in the violent overthrow of the Roman government. Unfortunately, over the decades, they had become less Jewish patriots and more criminals. So they became a criminal organization, kind of like the mafia. They were killers, they were thieves, they were thugs. Well, this Barabbas had been captured, and he was one of the most notorious of these thugs. And so Pilate gets the bright idea that he will offer Barabbas to the Jews instead of Jesus. And he's thinking in his mind, they won't dare take Barabbas. I mean, he's a hardened criminal. Surely they would rather have Jesus released instead of Barabbas. So he offers them that. But the Jews don't go for it. They say, no, give us Barabbas and go ahead and kill Jesus. So Pilate now has the dilemma. What do I do with Jesus? He keeps telling the Jews, I can't find anything wrong with what he's done. I can't find anything worthy of death. Your charges aren't really valid. You have not proven your charges. And so finally the Jews tell him, all right, this Jesus claims to be king. If you don't execute him, we're going to tell Rome that you're allowing a pretender to the throne, that you're allowing a challenger to Caesar, and you'll be in trouble. Well, Pilate was a politician above all things. Pilate had been assigned as a governor to Rome, to Palestine. This was kind of a backwoods area. Palestine was one of those, if you're appointed to be an ambassador to somewhere, you want to be appointed an ambassador to something important. You know, like today you'd want to be appointed to Russia or to China or to England or some big nation. Well, sometimes ambassadors are appointed to backwoods kind of places, you know, Iceland or something. Well, Palestine was one of those lesser jewels. And so Pilate had a lot of problems with the Jews. The Jews had never been easy to get along with. They had caused a lot of trouble. Pilate had to kill some people because of various issues, and the Jews didn't like him, and he had been getting some bad press back at home. And so Pilate knew he couldn't afford to get hot water back at home because the emperor and the Roman Senate would recall him, and that would not be a good thing. So Pilate realized he had to kind of go along with the Jews on this. If they were going to be adamant about it, he did not want to be the one taking the heat. His wife, during all this, had sent him a message. Now, the Romans were very superstitious. They worshipped a whole pantheon of gods. And Jesus had claimed to be a son of God, and for all Pilate knew, maybe he was. And so he was kind of scared of this whole situation anyway. So finally, Pilate orders a bowl of water brought, and he washes his hands, and he says, okay, I'm washing my hands of this. I'm not going to have anything to do with it. You take him and you crucify him if you want to. And the Jews had been yelling, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. So finally, Pilate says, okay, you do it. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm washing my hands. I'm not responsible. May his blood be on your heads. They say, yeah, on our heads and our children's heads. We'll take responsibility. So Pilate has Jesus flogged. Jesus is scourged, flogged. This is a horrible punishment. A Roman scourging was one of the most vicious punishments that a person could receive short of death itself. Matter of fact, many people died from a scourging. And so he had Jesus scourged, hoping that would appease the wrath of the mob. Now, a scourge was usually a short wooden handle with several long leather strips attached to it. And in the leather strips would be tied lead balls or sharp pieces of metal. And then a person would be stripped and hung up on a post, usually. And then a soldier would take the scourge and whip him across the back. Now, under Jewish law, a person could be only whipped 39 times. But Romans had no law like that at all. They could whip until the soldier got worn out doing it. So we don't know how many times Jesus was whipped. But these strips would have lead balls and sharp pieces of metal, broken pieces of bone sometimes. And the lead balls, when they would hit the person's back, would leave deep bruises. And the little pieces of metal would naturally tear and flick off pieces of flesh. And scourging was, like I said, a horrible punishment. It was just vicious. And so Jesus was first scourged. He was beaten with this whip. And he would have been a bloody mess after going through this. His back and legs and buttocks would just be ripped to shreds. So then, Jesus would have been crucified. Now, the normal crucifixion, and in this case, the text indicates this is what happened as well. The victim would have to carry his own cross to the place of execution. And there would be a kind of a parade. Now, the palace where Jesus was first sentenced and scourged was quite a ways from the gate that they went out to execute him. And so there would be a crucifixion party. Several soldiers, the victims, in this case Jesus and the two thieves. And they would carry their crosses, and ahead of them would walk one of the Roman soldiers with a sign telling the crimes of the victim, the person who's going to be crucified. And so Jesus tried to carry the cross, but he had been beaten so severely and had gone through so much that he was simply physically unable to carry the cross. And so the Romans had a law that in a foreign country, in an occupied country, they could impress anyone they wanted to do their work for them. Jesus had talked about if a Roman wants you to carry his pack, you carry it an extra mile. Well, in this case, they impressed a Jewish citizen to carry the cross for Jesus, because Jesus was simply physically unable to do it. And so as the procession would have wound through the streets of Jerusalem, people would throw vegetables and trash at the people and yell terrible things about them. And because usually if only people who were vicious criminals or traitors or slaves would be executed this way. Crucifixion was one of the most vicious, maybe the most vicious form of execution ever designed. And so Jesus would have walked with the crucifixion crowd outside the city gates to a small rise. And usually the crucifixions were done along roads so that people would walk by and see the crucified victim. And so there would have been probably a small hill outside the city gates where there 2 or 3 roads would be going by. And so Jesus was carried to the site of the crucifixion. The Romans would assign usually 4 soldiers to crucifixion duty. And one of the soldiers would have an apron. And he would have nails and a hammer. And at a signal from the centurion, The victim would be thrown down on the cross, and his arms would be stretched out, but not as far as they would go. There would be a crook in the arms, and I'll explain in a moment. They would then kneel on the arm, in this case, on the arm of Jesus, and they would take out one of these nails. There were huge nails, spikes, and drive it through the hand. Now, the word hand, translated here from the original text, can mean anything from the wrist on up. If you drove the spike through the palm, it wouldn't be strong enough to hold the weight of the body, and it would tear out. So usually they would drive the spike through the wrist. If you feel in your wrist, there you can feel the bones. There's a triangular area there. You can drive the nail through the wrist, and it would hold up the weight of the body. It would also sever a nerve in the arm, and that would cause shocks to go through the system. It would be a very painful experience, not to mention the pain of driving the nail through. And so both arms would be nailed to the cross. Now, the reason that they would not extend the arms straight out is because when a body is hanging on the cross, when your weight is suspended from your arms, it paralyzes your diaphragm. Now, you can breathe in all you want to, but you cannot exhale. And so, if they stuck the arms out straight and nailed them, then the victim would die within a few minutes because he would suffocate. Matter of fact, the worst pain of the crucifixion is suffocation. That's normally the cause of death. Now, what they would do is they would nail the feet to the cross and then nail the hands, and then the person's entire existence on the cross. Some strong men could live a day or two on the cross. Their entire time on the cross would be a series of relaxing and pushing oneself up to breathe, because you could relax for a minute, but then you couldn't breathe out, so you'd have to push yourself up. Of course, when your feet are nailed to the cross and you push yourself up on your feet, the pain would be horrendous, and then pulling yourself up by your hands as well. And so Jesus was nailed to the cross, and he was placed upon it. Now, in those days, from what I've read about crucifixion, now, in most movies and pictures we've seen of the crucifixion, the cross is always several feet in the air, but generally they were not. Generally, they were just a couple of feet off the ground. At any rate, Jesus was nailed to the cross. He was crucified. The pain would have been horrible. Now, as an act of mercy, the victim was usually offered some wine vinegar, which was formed as kind of an analgesic. It would dull the pain a little bit. Jesus refused to drink of this at first because he had to experience the full measure of the cross. Now, at the end, once he had finished his work, then he took a drink of it. But early on, he did not. So Jesus was crucified between the two thieves. Over his head was placed the sign that detailed his crimes, why he was being crucified. And then, at the foot of the cross, we remember that his mother and some of the women who loved him were there. Jesus, at this point, told John that he was in charge of his mother. And so Jesus was nailed to the cross. This was the most horrible form of execution that man's mind has ever come up with. Even today, we would be hard-pressed to come up with something that would be more painful and more cruel than the cross. As I said, a man living on, and Jesus was on the cross for hours. And during that whole time, there would be a terrible feeling of suffocation. So Jesus died for us. He was nailed to the cross. And next time we will pick up there. Thank you for joining us today.